Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for tuning in again. In this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about translations of the Quran. As a person who was part of a team that worked on a translation, I was often asked during this process what translation I recommend. And that's a really complicated answer because there are a lot of translations, and in truth, different translations do different things. So different people have different needs and different translations will do things for them. I'm going to address that here towards the end of this video. What I want to do in this video is first talk about the two translations that I do recommend, and I have often recommended, which are those by A.J. Arberry and the one by Ali Qarai. After that, I'm going to get into some more technical issues and talk about a few translations that people tend to lean towards and why I don't favor them. This isn't a condemnation of those translations at all, it's just why I don't personally recommend them. So if you just want to see what I recommend, you got about 7 minutes, you'll get that. If you want to get a little bit more in depth, then keep following for another 5 to 7 minutes after that, and you'll get an idea of some of the principles that I think should be followed and things that one should look for when one's looking for a Quran translation. Now, I of course do highly recommend this translation that we did in the Study Quran with myself and Maria Dekek, Generale Muhammad Rustam with Sayyid Hussein Nasser as the editor-in-chief. And I'll get to why I recommend that and what I think it does that some other translations haven't done towards the end of this. But I don't really want to plug this. That's not my purpose here. What I want to do is actually talk about some other translations that are very good. One, A.J. Arberry. Before the Study Quran came out, this is the one that I always recommended for somebody who wanted to get an idea of how the Quran feels, in a sense, the flow, the eloquence of the Arabic. Now, when this translation came out, I think it was a very vast improvement upon the translations that existed. Nonetheless, it's clear that Arberry drew from previous translations of people such as Rodwell and Saleh and Palmer, and he retained some of the errors that they made. This is in fact most evident in probably in the sword verse, Surah 9, verse 5. And in fact, Muhammad Abdel Halim has addressed that in this recent book where the first chapter is about the sword verse. And he goes in depth as to the errors that Arberry makes in that translation and the misinterpretations that those errors lead to. So I highly recommend this book. In fact, I recommend all of the essays in this book for one who wants to study the Quran. But let's get back to what it is that Arberry does well. This is obviously why I'm recommending the book. Now, Nabia Abba said in her review of Arberry when it came out, she said, Arberry's translation reveals, quote, a mystical ear, poetic diction, and a touch of mysticism, all of which combined with the above to produce an interpretation of the Quran that is genuine and artistic to a degree unattained by previous translators. Now, this, I think, could actually be said of many of the translators that followed Arberry as well, especially the artistic dimension of his translation. There's a way that Arberry captures what I call the vaunted immediacy, the kind of majestic nature of the Quran that few other translators have attained. He uses a style that is reminiscent of early modern English. By that I mean the English of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. A lot of people don't like that. For a lot of people, that's a far stretch for them to get into. But I actually think that it better represents the Arabic of the Quran than many other styles, than the people who try to put it into what we might call a contemporary English, a contemporary idiom, and make it, quote, accessible, unquote. Because, well, great literature isn't always accessible. Great literature challenges us. And the translation of Arberry is smooth, artistic, and at times challenging. Now let me read a few examples. This first example is from Surah Al-Layl, Surah 92. This is verses 1 through 11. By the night in shrouding and the day in splendor, and that which created the male and the female, surely your striving is to diverse ends. As for him who gives and is God-fearing, and confirms the reward most fair, we shall surely ease him to the easing. But as for him who is a miser and self-sufficient, and cries lies to the reward most fair, we shall surely ease him to the hardship. His wealth shall not avail him when he perishes. Now, for me, that is smooth, easy, and eloquent. Here's another example. Surah Al-Hadid, Surah 57, verses 1 through 3. All that is in the heavens and the earth magnifies God. He is the Almighty, the All-Wise. To him belongs the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. He gives life, and he makes to die, and he is powerful over everything. He is the first and the last, the outward and the inward. He has knowledge of everything. It is he that created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, then seated himself upon the throne. Now, in addition to these eloquent passages that capture to some degree the majestic immediacy and kind of transcendent nature of the Arabic of the Quran, Arberry is relatively consistent in how he translates central terms and recurring phrases in the Quran. This is not something that can be said of many other translations. For example, Iqbal seems to change kind of halfway through his translation with how he translates the phrase as-sirat al-mustaqim, that is the straight path. All of a sudden, it goes from straight path to right way, I think it is, and one can't really see what the connection is within the translation. So one kind of loses the trail and the connection to previous passages in that way. This can happen occasionally with Arberry's translation, but not as much as others. So all in all, I would say that if one still wants a translation that has that eloquence, that is in a kind of early modern English, Arberry is still the one that I recommend. Now, the other translation that I often recommend is that of Ali Quli Qarai. I really found this translation to be quite excellent, and I was really surprised when I came upon it because hardly anybody had spoken about it. And one of the great things about this translation for somebody who's learning Arabic is, if you see here, the translation has the Arabic right next to it, but it has it phrase by phrase. Not just the whole verse, but the exact phrase is right next to the exact Arabic. So if you are studying Arabic, you can use this very well to identify the exact translation in there. I think that this is a model that other translations that employ the Arabic should in fact follow, but I haven't seen it followed by others. Now, I'm not as fond of the English in this, although it is more accurate and more consistent than almost any other translation, and it's more accurate than Arberry. In fact, I don't think I've found any passage where I could say that Ali Quli Qarai made an egregious error. There are definitely things that, as a translator of the Quran, I disagree with, but there aren't things where I can say, no, that's wrong, that's not a way that that should be done. He does use brackets more often than I like, and I'll refer to one of those passages in a minute, but overall, he does a very good job. For an example, I will use the same two passages that I did with Arberry. Here, for example, is Surah Al-Hadid, Surah 57, the first 3 verses. Whatever there is in the heavens glorifies Allah, and whatever there is in the earth, and He is the Almighty, the All-Wise. To Him belongs the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. He gives life and brings death, and He has power over all things. He is the first and the last, the manifest and the hidden, and He has knowledge of all things. Now, I don't like the use of Allah in the Quran translation, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But beyond that, I do think that that's a very good, accurate translation. And here is Surah Al-Layl, which I actually think he does a better job here because he doesn't use bracketed phrases. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute. Here it is, Surah Al-Layl, Surah 92, verses 1 through 11. By the night when it envelops, by the day when it brightens, by Him who created the male and the female, your endeavors are indeed unlike. As for him who gives and is God-wary, and confirms the best promise, we shall surely ease him into facility. But as for him who is stingy and self-complacent and denies the best promise, we shall surely ease him into hardship. His wealth shall not avail him when he perishes. Now see, I think that that's very accurate, very precise, a very good job. Now here's what I sometimes don't like in this translation. Now what I'm going to do now is transition a bit more into what are some of the things I think that you should be looking for if you're looking for a different translation of some kind. First and foremost, this I think is one of the most important things in looking for a Quran translation, is to avoid brackets. For some reason, when people translate the Quran, there are more things put in brackets than the translation of pretty much any other text that I have seen. The Quran is an elusive text, yes, but that is intentional. For my purposes, or what I think should be attained, is an English that opens up to the multiple meanings in the same way that the Arabic does. Because any time that there is a bracketed phrase inserted in the translation, that is the preferred interpretation of the translator. And you go back and you look at the commentary tradition, and you will find that there are 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12 other alternatives that commentators might have thought should have been inserted there if you were going to insert something. So I think it's best to actually leave these out. Now here's an example in Ali Quri Qara'i. Alright, this is from Surah Al-A'la. Many of those of you who are Muslim and have memorized parts of the Quran, you'll be familiar with this. Alright? I'll go up to the 6th verse because that's where we start to get some of these insertions. Alright? Celebrate the name of your Lord, the most exalted, who created and proportioned, who determined and guided, who brought forth the pasture, then turned it into a black scum. We shall have you recite the Quran, and here the Quran is in brackets. Then you will not forget any of it, and any of it is in brackets. Now that's where I think, for example, you've got you shall not forget, all right? Here, it doesn't have to be the Quran that you shall not forget. It could be God that you shall not forget. It could be the fundamental teachings of religion that you shall not forget. It doesn't have to be inserted in there, and even so, with what preceded, it would be an obvious interpretation to any reader. Now this becomes quite evident when you look at translations of the Fatiha. The Fatiha, you'll often find that people put in you alone we worship, and you alone, or from you alone, we seek help. This really is unnecessary to put in the alone. The Arabic says, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. And here what's happening in the Arabic is that the direct object is being put in front of the verb for emphasis, just in the same way that in English we would put a direct object or an indirect object in front of the verb in order to emphasize that part of the sentence. So for example, if I say, I give to you the book, I'm emphasizing you, not the book, and I'm doing that for a reason. Or to you I give the book would be a better example there. We don't need to you alone, I give the book, in order to explain it. So this is actually something that I look for frequently in order to evaluate the quality of a translation. Just go right to the Fatiha and see what types of insertions they've put in. And then I like to flip through and look at many of the bracketed phrases that one will find throughout. In fact, when we were working on the study Quran, this is one of the things that we gradually did. We gradually eliminated more and more bracketed phrases in the translation in order to allow the text to speak for itself with less of the insertions of the translators. All right, so that does it for the first part of this video, where I want to talk about the two translations, or really three if you throw in the study Quran, that I would recommend for somebody who wants to find a good, accurate translation of the Quran that gives them a real sense of the text. Now let me talk about a few others, really two others, that people have often asked me about and that many people incline to. These are the translations of Muhammad Asad and of Muhammad Abdel Halim. Muhammad Abdel Halim is currently the most widely read translation of the Quran. I actually used it in a class one time, and I, like many of my colleagues, found that for a teaching text it was very difficult to use because it often gives very different translations for the very same word or the very same passage. So for example, the word hasiba, which occurs 4 times in the Quran, is translated in 4 completely different ways. And there really is no justification for it. This isn't something where it's being used in a different context or something along those lines. But there's actually a better illustration of this is, for example, the phrase وَهُوَ عَلِيمٌ بِذَاتِ الصُّدُورِ or وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِذَاتِ الصُّدُورِ. That is, and God knows what lies within breasts. That's the way that we have it translated every time that it occurs in the study Quran. However, every time that it occurs in Muhammad Abdel Halim's translation, it's translated differently. Here are a few examples, all right? In Surah 3, verse 119, God knows exactly what is in everyone's heart. Surah 3, verse 154, God knows your innermost thoughts very well. Surah 5, verse 7, God has full knowledge of the secrets of the heart. Surah 8, verse 43, He knows the secrets of the hearts. Another translation in Surah 11, verse 5, He knows well the innermost secrets of the heart. Another translation in Surah 42, verse 24, He has full knowledge of what is in the heart. Now this is just an example. I could go on and read all of them, but I think that that really throws off the inner consistency and inner referentiality of the Quran and can prevent people from seeing the connections that one can find between different parts of the text. Here's another one that I think is actually far more important, is the phrase Ta'ala amma yushrikun, all right? The way that Abdul Halim has it is quite different in many different places. For example, Surah 10, verse 18, He is far above the partner gods they associate with Him. Surah 16, verse 1, He is far above anything they join with Him. Surah 16, verse 3, He is far above whatever they join with Him. Surah 7, verse 109, God is far above the partners they set up alongside Him. Surah 23, verse 92, He is far above any party they claim for Him. Surah 27, verse 63, God is far above the partners they put beside Him. Surah 28, verse 68, May He be exalted above the partners they ascribe to Him. None of these translations are wrong, but they are quite different from one another. And to my mind, that prevents the reader who does not have access to the Arabic from seeing the way in which these oft-repeated phrases in the Quran play against one another in different parts of the text. At the same time, there are phrases like Tajri min tahtiha al-anhar that Abdul Halim has captured very well and is very consistent with how he renders them. And so it's a mixed bag in a way. The other thing is, as I've said before, I don't really incline to the more contemporary forms of translation. I might be wrong in this, I'll admit that. I was an English lit major, and this is part of my personal proclivity. It could be. But I think that when it comes to great literature challenges us. We don't sit down and say, well, you know what I really loved about Ulysses by James Joyce? It was just so accessible. Nobody says that. Nobody goes about Dostoevsky or Franz Kafka and says, well, you know, Dostoevsky is certainly very accessible. People say, it's a very challenging read, but I got a lot out of it. We don't sit down and say, well, the best thing about Shakespeare is how accessible he is. Great literature challenges us. Great literature makes us engage it And through that process of engagement, it can have a transformative effect. This is what I think Arberry has achieved better than pretty much any translation before him, and any translation pretty much after. I haven't seen another translator that achieved it as well as Arberry. Now, the other translation that people ask me about a lot is that of Muhammad Asad. Now, Muhammad Asad made wonderful contributions to the understanding of the Quran in the notes that he provided in the text. I, as a student of the Quran, when I started studying the Quran, his notes were very useful to me to get into the text, and I recommend them to anyone. There's one caveat, however, which is that he has a particular theological perspective that is very evident in both the translation and the notes. And this is one wherein he is uncomfortable with the idea of miracles in the Quran. This affects the translation, and this is quite evident in many of the notes. For example, the incident in which the Prophet ﷺ is said to have split the moon into two halves. He actually says that this is something that didn't happen, it was a misunderstanding, it could have been this and the other thing. Well, the transmission of the accounts that state that this event occurred is considered by Sunni authorities to be mutawatir. That is, conveyed by so many different lines of transmission that we really cannot deny that this happened. But yet Asad does not incline to accepting it. In his translation, here are some ways in which that comes out. For example, in Surah 3, verse 49, he writes, "I have come unto you with a message from your sustainer. I shall create for you out of clay, as it were, the shape of your destiny, and then breathe into it, so that it may become your destiny by God's leave." Now, these are the words of Jesus to the people. Well, here is what's wrong, is that he doesn't like the idea of Jesus having brought life to a bird. Here is how it, I think, should be translated, and is translated by most people, but using the words of Asad. "I have brought you a sign from your Lord. I will create for you out of clay the shape of a bird. Then I will breathe into it, and it will be a bird by God's leave." Asad does not like the idea of a miracle being performed here. Here is another instance, and this is something that other people have brought up before. In Surah 4, verse 158, Asad translates it as God exalted him, that is Jesus, to himself, rather than God raised him, Jesus, to himself, which is found in most translations. And then Asad adds this note, quote, "Nowhere in the Quran is there any warrant for the popular belief that God has taken up Jesus bodily in his lifetime into heaven." In this instance, Asad is clearly going against the majority of the interpretive tradition, and the vast majority. And you'll find this comes in many ways throughout the text, such as his treatment of jinn and his treatment of angels and things along these lines. For those who incline to that perspective, that's fine. Please go ahead and use this translation for those purposes. And again, like I say, the notes are extremely useful, and he provided an access to the interpretive tradition that no other translator in English had provided before him. Now, these are just a few of my observations regarding translations of the Quran. I'd like to know more about what you would like to know about regarding translations of the Quran and the Quranic text itself. If you found this helpful, please be sure to like the video, to subscribe, and of course, to share it. And also, please do let me know your thoughts in the comments section below so that I can have a better idea of how to best serve you. Thank you very much. Take care.